Hi, and welcome to the Psytelligence Podcast. We are very excited to have Kimberly Chew here. She is the co-lead for the psychedelics practice at Husch Blackwell. And we're going to start off. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, Kimberly, what you're doing, and what's exciting right now.
Oh, thank you so much, Eric. I'm so glad to be back on your podcast. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to everyone. So I'm a senior counsel at Husch Blackwell, and we're about 1,000 attorney law firm, AmLaw 100 law firm with a national footprint. And we're like to say that we're the first AmLaw 100 to have a formal psychedelics and emerging therapies practice. And I myself use my scientific background to help physicians and academic medical centers and people who are interested in getting into the industry to navigate the complex, healthcare regulations and manage risks going forward, since the psychedelics outside of research are basically illegal under the Controlled Substances Act.
Thank you. Excellent. That's wonderful. And so it seems like as a leader within establishing that practice, what have been some sort of interesting kind of trends or themes as that gets off the ground?
It has been interesting to see more and more people enter into the space. There's a lot of trepidation, which is understandable. I mean, I initially met you, Eric, at the Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver, 2023 in June. That's a seminal moment, actually, I think, for the entire industry. I did run into a lot of people who were MDs, physicians, were very innocent. Uh, they wanted more information for certain because they see an emerging area and they see this as a possibility, with high potential to help people, but yet it's illegal on the Controlled Substances Act. And so that's one trend we've been seeing. It's just a lot of people wanting to enter the space, but because of the scheduling, and no one wants to put their licenses in jeopardy because of that. So at the same time, there's a lot of people who are entrepreneurial and want to get into the space, especially in those states that have now create their own regulatory schemes, such as Oregon and Colorado. We see a lot of people trying to think of new ways of capitalizing on that. So that's a trend that we're seeing. But it's one thing we really try to count clients on is that no matter what the state level legalization status is, it's still illegal at the federal level, and it's different from cannabis in that regard. That cannabis is also Schedule One, but cannabis has had the Cole Memorandum, and they actually have an opinion from the Department of Justice stating that if a state had its own regulatory scheme, they would not be enforcing the federal scheme in that state. Yeah, it is all subject to discretion, obviously, but we don't have that in psychedelics, and so that's one of those things. There's a lot of people that are really wanting to help. There's such a big need for better mental health options out there, and a lot of folks that we're trying to help are in communities such as veterans and first responders who do need tremendous burnout and so forth, and what is it they can do now. So I mean, there's some very honorable intentions out there. It's just one of those things that we are still cautioning folks about the Schedule One under the federal scheme. It's different. And so in a sense, it doesn't even matter what the states do.
Mm-hmm.
The federal illegality of it. So.
And so, one, I think, there's the interest of the precedent of the cannabis legalization, and that may provide, both a structure and maybe help accelerate that in psychedelics. And two, we find ourselves in the interesting space where, what are purported to be well-intentioned and beneficial, legislation for psychedelics may actually be doing more harm than good, especially when we look at the potential benefit for the mental health crisis. And so, it's interesting that at least some constituents feel like we're a little upside down with that legislation, while others feel that it's actually tremendously necessary and not enough. So any thoughts on that? Any, on how those type of dynamics can get resolved?
Yeah, I agree with you, Eric. There seem to be two camps, at least two camps in that regard, where there's the pro legalization, absent, any FDA approval of the drug. And at the same time, I kind of fall in that camp that if I, what we've seen in, what I've seen in Canada is that you get runaway labeling if you do have this kind of more, if it's not regulated at the federal level, that it goes through an approval process where labeling and efficacy and safety are being worked out under a single kind of standard. Uh, if you don't do that, then you're left with 50 states or 20 states or 30 states in Canada that have each their own kind of regulatory scheme, and some have labeling requirements, some don't, and it's very I'm very myself in my personal opinion, I'm worried about the labeling, runaway claims of people saying that, oh well, so will cure all your ills, and if you're anxious or upset, you could take this and it will help right away, and without integration or without
Mhm.
support. And I think we have to be very cautious about that. And there's a lot of psychedelics are pretty powerful. I think a lot of people will agree with that, but other folks just think, well, we can microdose and maybe that would be okay. But that's also not been scientifically
Mhm.
um, studied in a long term, because we do know that certain psychedelics will hit also the 5-HT2A sub B type receptor, which are located in the hearts and can impair heart valves. And we don't know, what it's like in the long term, even at the microdose level, we don't know. And I think for folks thinking I could do microdosing and feel like I'm safe because I'm not feeling any perceptible effect on my day-to-day life. I mean, something might be happening in your heart and you don't know, or you might be susceptible. I mean, and have you been evaluated for that by a physician or any, medical facility, that sort of thing. And it's just one of those things that I really feel that it should go through FDA approval, or it should go through a single process where we can guarantee, have some kind of guarantees as to sourcing, potency, identity of the active ingredient, as well as labeling, accurate labeling, so we don't have runaway claims on these drugs coming out. So
Mhm.
yeah, so I'm more of the camp that I think it really should go through the FDA process.
Absolutely. FDA for safety. The regulatory framework has prevented even research for the FDA approvals for 50 years or so. So I think then from that perspective, it would be to kind of build on the current momentum of deregulation and decriminalization that's happening, particularly in research. But that also then happens in the ecosystem where the criminalization has I think in two camps. One, before the existence even of our legal system, there's a long indigenous tradition of the use of these materials outside, any legislative purview, and then within our, sort of more modern cultural context, there's a subculture that had to operate outside the law. And so that is that's another impact of criminalizing it, because it was still there as a human need, as a human activity. And so then that is going to have to be reintegrated. And what I'm hearing is sometimes there's a bit of resistance to overly commercializing this, of making this, bringing this into kind of a Western, legal model. But I do see lots of great initiatives by like MAPS to include indigenous perspectives, and so it's interesting that all these are kind of coming together, and that each action has, whether intended or not, some consequence that ultimately has to be reconciled into what would hopefully be a beneficial, inclusive, accessible, and holistic model. At least from some camps, that would be the ideal. What do you see as the biggest block to that happening right now? A
Well,
broad question, but please.
yeah. Well, in terms of, I mean, you bring up great points in that we absolutely need to be including the indigenous perspective, and honoring just that these are being used culturally and historically, uh, you know, since humans probably began. I mean, it's one of those things that I think it's difficult to work that in, but there are companies that are working that perspective in, and working in finding different ways. So I know one of the concerns is intellectual property law, for instance. And so there have been efforts underway to do things like how do you patent pledges, I've heard, are big in this space, or are emerging in this space where they go ahead and get a patent on a molecule or a formulation, and then put a pledge on there saying that they want this patent, but they're not going to enforce it in the case of indigenous use. Uh, use, that sort of thing. So that I don't. I mean, that hasn't been tested per se. Seen, at least I'm not aware of a test where a patent's been granted and it's pledged on it, and then someone says, "Oh, I'm infringing on your patent, and so I'm going to, I'm infringing it for indigenous cultural use. So I don't expect." I mean, I don't expect anyone to say it that way, or for it to come out that way. But I haven't seen the pledges challenge per se. Although that is, I think that's a unique way. I mean, that's unique in the pharmaceutical space because generally pharmaceuticals, under the Western, kind of modality of developing drugs is the way they're expensive to run clinical trials. And in order to do that, you have to build up an intellectual property portfolio. And so, if you have an intellectual property portfolio that doesn't, that has these patent pledges in it, I mean, I think if you have them narrow enough, I'm sure they're still valuable. But I mean, pharmaceuticals have a very healthy intellectual property portfolio to have investors invest in them, invest in their, and have the investors know that their investment is protected by law because no one wants to see their investment go up in smoke, frankly. So it's been difficult, I think, for a lot of entities in this space to handle the idea that they want to make these medicines more accessible by going through the FDA route, yet they do not want to be seen as big. Is another problem that because the idea is that they want to be seen as inclusive of indigenous and cultural uses of these medicines. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot writing in the industry about how these first ones come out, how MAPS is handling MDMA, as it moves forward. NDA process in the FDA shows that's just a new drug application that we are anticipating to be submitted at some point this year. But yeah, it will be interesting to see how that plays out.
Nice, yeah, and I think that the pledges on the patents are an interesting carve out, and that could be a mechanism. And I think that also the interesting perspective of when we bring capital into it, especially capital at scale, that becomes an obstacle in certain ways, but it also becomes an enablement in other ways, right? And so having to go through the model of raising the capital, of getting the approval, and we have like an example of S-ketamine, right? So we had the common ketamine in use. S-ketamine was patented, and then there was some intellectual property around there. There were clinical studies that were done. There's some brand equity, and so, but then the cost becomes prohibitive, almost relative to the generic ketamine, and so we're seeing much more sort of off-label use of it for depression and anxiety, the traditional ketamine, in response to the cost barriers for S-ketamine. And so it'll be interesting to manage that because when we bring in capital, people bring in their investments and they want to make money. But there's also, and that provides stability, it provides safety, it provides accessibility, and even the marketing outreach for awareness. But then, at what cost? And so how do we balance these models? How do we, how do we relate when there's asymmetry between, something that, the let's say, big pharma, and then just, indigenous populations, that, are not even necessarily capital based. And so those are good insights. What's exciting in that, like what right now in the space is the most interesting thing? There's some legislation recently in California moving through the House, but like what in general is exciting? What gives you hope right now?
Well, what gives me hope right now is that we've been seeing a lot. Well, when FDA came out with their new guidelines for psychedelic clinical trials, that did give me a lot of hope because um, it just makes me feel like that maybe we have the floodgates, but just we've not seen federal funding at all. I mean, there was no federal funding at all for psychedelic research at any level for decades. And then just I think about 2 years ago, there was some funding for LSD studies, and I think what really gives me hope is that with this FDA kind of acknowledgement that hey, there's quite a few of these psychedelic clinical trials ongoing, that maybe there will be more federal funding, more federal money available pour into the space, which is really dearly needed. Because up until now, I mean, MAPS has had to deal with all the stigma associated with psychedelics. They've had to rely on not any public money, but rely on solely, private investors.
Mm-hmm.
Believed in 5 decades of stigma. And so the fact that we're seeing kind of this action at the federal level gives me a lot of. You probably also saw that I believe HHS, Human Health Services, came out with a recommendation for cannabis to be Schedule 3.
Yeah.
Uh, maybe, I mean, if there's hope for cannabis, maybe there's hope at that level for also certain psychedelics to get rescheduled to a lower schedule than Schedule 1 and the Controlled Substances Act. And that gives me a lot of hope that that these could be, if we could get more developers into this space, that gives me a lot of hope.
Excellent. Yeah, and we're seeing what's interesting, I think, about the current movement, if you will, is that it's shockingly in some cases bipartisan, and so there have been a couple articles, the Dark Side of the Moon, where essentially people who are diametrically opposed on almost every other aspect of the political spectrum are working together on legislation. Are you seeing that at the policy level a lot? And what do you make of that?
It is very encouraging to see both sides of the aisle come together, and I respect them. I believe the latest effort I've heard that seems so encouraging is Kentucky. My understanding is that Kentucky is, well, they have so it's interesting how the opioid crisis is kind of playing into this a little bit. So the opioid settlements have been coming out, and they're pretty big, right? They're pretty big settlements. I believe that Kentucky is one of those places that is hoping to look into the opioid settlements with their community, looking into game studies, and that would, and again, some of those has been forward in the literature with addiction disorders. So I think that's a very interesting, folding together of something that's completely horrific, like the opioid crisis, and trying to turn it into. I just love that. I just love how they're trying to take this and almost like a phoenix or rising on the ashes, just turn it into a solution for their community. So that's a big policy shift that that was kind of unexpected, right? And I think Kentucky has a high military population, so they have a lot of, and that to me is very striking. Yeah.
Yeah, it gives me hope, and I recall being quite surprised at just how deep that was, and I think that the idea of first responders, of military veterans. There's the Mikey Day Act is being it's a veteran who ended up committing suicide. There's some policy there. So yeah, what do you think the blocks are on that side then? Because they're certainly, they're the culture war issues, right? And those are, and I often see that reflected a lot in the research. There are people who are just like, those are bad, they're wrong, psychedelics are, and they tend to correlate conservative. And yet there's the openness to the effectiveness of it, right? So they take these people who are very venerated for their service. But then how is that reconciled with the culture war issues? And then on the left, there's this idea that these things are good and they're right and, inherently, and sometimes then we run into some of those safety issues. And so, What are your thoughts on that kind of that sort of that cross purposed context?
I think it's a hard one to address, and I don't think there's any a single solution. I've heard of, I mean, so the idea of people coming together to help our first responders and help our military veterans, I think that is a unifying idea, for instance. But I have talked to a lot of developers in the space, drug developers in the space, who are developing the second generation psychedelics, for instance. And so there's also, controversy in that too, where they're trying to basically chemistry out the trip, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they don't have a psycho. They have psychoactive. They want psychoactive effects. That they want the neuronal regeneration or neuronal growth that's happening in the brain, but with any feelings of dissociation or just feeling like any no acute phase getting out of it per se. So, I mean, you speak to a lot of these folks, and their hope is really kind of gain acceptance for those folks that may be more reluctant, but they want them to use, but they don't want the psychedelic portion at all. Like they don't want any trip, they don't want any, and at the same time, there's other people that is actually pretty critical, right, for the spiritual growth,
Mm-hmm.
uh, so forth. I think that probably needs to be more with more research, but there's a lot of research that I've looked at, especially by Bull Dolan's laboratory, that seems very compelling.
Mm-hmm.
You need to actually have that, hit that portion that actually will activate a psychedelic trip for a while because it hits open period that is critical for neuronal growth.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll see how things work out because it does seem that as many people that are opposed, there are people who that like a part of our medical model. There are other players in the space, right? Other drug developers, other researchers that are trying to address that in some way. Um, and I don't know if that's going to be perfect. We don't know. The second generation still, I believe, one or two that are phase one clinical trials. I mean, they're kind of, it's going to take a while since there's like 4 phases of clinical trials. So, yeah, we shall see. But hopefully that will help the appetite. Also, I'm a big believer in education.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I do hope that as these newer drugs are built, that we can educate people. And I really, and it's taken a long, I do believe like, a generation ago, discussing mental health was not a thing. It's something you discuss openly. And with more education and more exposure, I think the population has become more embracing of the idea that mental health is, and we should not be ashamed to talk about it. We should embrace talking about it, embrace talking about solutions, embrace helping each other get through it, and seeing that each other find solutions. And so I think the key thing for psychedelics, despite all of the decades worth of stigma and cultural wars and so forth, I think with a lot of education and maybe these tools coming out, we can find some way to bring these to make them more accessible and to really help people. That's my hope.
Nice. Either to kind of bring the sort of the loss of control and ego death out of the experience and maintain the benefit of, let's say, neuroplasticity or other benefits, and then also potentially so addressing it right at the root in the sort of the causal mechanism in the brain, but then also finding ways of making it a little less scary through some of these proxy studies and through the legislation. If it makes it through the process, that's going to give a lot of people the confidence there. And so that kind of actually leads me to a current topic I'm seeing a lot of interest in, which is using psychedelics for palliative or end of life care. And so, what do you see? One is the regulatory landscape there, and two, what would what's blocking it? What would really unblock it? What should folks be aware of?
So in terms of end of life care, that's interesting that you bring that point up. We were working with Kathleen Tucker, who is the attorney for the Ames versus DEA court case that's in the Ninth Circuit.
Mhm.
I think it's going to be heard in a couple of weeks, actually, a hearing. So the idea in that case was that we So our firm helped with, we did an amicus brief. So we represented a number of physicians that was supporting Kathleen Tucker's client. So Kathleen Tucker's client is Dr. Sunil Agarwal, who is a palliative care physician in Washington. And he noted that, hey, this would be helpful for my clients, for my patients that are facing end-of-life issues and their anxiety. And psilocybin is being tested in clinical trials. So shouldn't it qualify for under right to try, for that I could get a license from DEA to administer to my clients, to my patients who are suffering end of life issues, and because he doesn't want put his own DEA licensure at jeopardy to make a ruling. So initially the court came down saying that, oh, this issue is not right. We can't actually. They didn't ever get to the merits of the argument.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first one, and so now we're at the second round, and where Dr. Agarwal has petitioned the DEA to reschedule psilocybin, and so we're going to see DEA's response on that. Their initial response is that, yeah, we don't have to. So, but then we're going to hear oral arguments, so we're going to see what happens after that. And so under right to try laws, federal right to try laws, if a drug is undergoing clinical trials, it therefore has a medical use, a legitimate medical use, that physicians should be able to apply under right to try laws to use that drug on their patients. But because psilocybin is under Schedule 1, it's pretty special in terms of that. And so there's usually an exception. You can't really write to try laws. It seems an exception that if it's a Schedule 1 drug, well, then you can't do it. You can't get any kind of licensure for that. So in order to overcome that, it does seem, I mean, we're kind of seeing that play out right now. Either we will need to get rescheduled, or it would need to get some kind of recognition under right to try that this could be seen as any other kind of medicine under right to try, that you could possibly go ahead and administer it under the right to try. Under right to try, the patient has to be basically dying. So it's one of those things that they're a dying patient. You should be able to access clinical trial drugs. So yeah, hopefully we will see this happen in a couple weeks. We'll have oral argument, and then we'll have decision. The decision takes a while, so generally, so yeah, we won't have a resolution on that anytime soon. I mean, yeah. So I think either rescheduling or some kind of recognition under right to try probably needs to happen for that to happen, or for access and for end of life anxiety. But there's so many studies that show that psilocybin is really helpful with end of life anxiety. With all kinds of patients, there's cancer patients and AIDS patients, and all kinds of folks that. And then I guess the argument that it gets kind of squirrely in terms of if you have a long-term condition, and you're not immediately. I don't know what that would be, but immediately die. This is a long-term thing you're dealing with. You could die any moment, but so you're anxious. Argument like, okay, well, do you have to have a rule for that you have to be dying within a certain time frame in order to qualify? But it's one of those. I think it's one of those things that will need to be grappled with and should be grappled with at some point.
Thank you. And as we conclude here, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and perspective. And if they have questions, or if they're in need of legal counsel, what kind of things do you help folks with?
So we actually a full service law firm. I myself help physicians and academic medical centers with their issues concerning psychedelics, psychedelic studies, for instance, but any kind of clinical trial or any kind of research. Myself, I have like a 16-year back. I was a research and development scientist for 16 years before becoming an attorney. So I like to help people who are in the research space. But our firm does all kinds of healthcare related work, as well as corporate formations, tax issues. We work with hospitals, big physician groups, and as well as regular litigation, intellectual property issues. And then I can't even get into that. I mean, we have written, we have all like food, a thriving cannabis practice, all kinds of things. But I encourage people to check us out at our huschblackwell.com website if they're interested, or just email me directly. I'd be happy to talk to them and direct them in any way, and just want to be helpful and of service.
Excellent, wonderful. Thank you again so much. So yes, Kimberly Chew, the co-lead for psychedelics at Husch Blackwell on the Psytelligence Psychedelic Market Intelligence Podcast. Have a wonderful day, and reach out to Kimberly. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Eric.